So I'd like to thank Siggraph for having me out here today. This room is huge, and I'm wildly intimidated by it. So if I stumble a little bit, it's because there's so many of you out there and so many seats. So I'm here today to talk about the animator's workflow, to showcase some ideas you may or may not have considered, and to hopefully be a catalyst for introspection by telling you our story about creating animation for Moss. Now, during today's presentation, you may notice some overlapping of information from my GDC presentation earlier this year entitled Animating Quill, Creating an Emotional Experience. But Quill here, the mousy protagonist of Moss, and her personality are not part of today's presentation. If you'd like to know more about the animation direction that went into Quill's personality, my talk is freely available on the GDC website and YouTube. Just search for Animating Quill, and it's the first thing. Hope you get a chance to check it out. If you haven't already, it really does make a great companion to what I'm going to present here today. So any good story needs a prologue. So let me begin by telling a little bit about Polyarc, the studio. We're an entertainment studio with a primary focus on VR and AR game development. The studio consists of 14 full-time employees who are all industry vets from the AAA space. Such studios as Bungie, Rockstar, ArenaNet, Monolith, and many more. We all share a common excitement about the potential of VR and AR. But to be completely transparent, we're really just a group of colleagues who wanted to take a risk and try and strike out on our own. We have very understanding families who've been extremely patient with us. We're gamers, movie buff, geeks, bookworms, shitty comedians. We just love what we do, and we want to keep doing it. And we've managed to get a good start despite having little prior experience making VR games. Moss is our first game as a new studio, and the culmination of a lot of hard work, planning, emotional investment, and honestly being in the right place at the right time. The original concept for Moss began in mid-2015 by Polyarc's 3 founders. They wanted to make a VR game that played with the ideas of scale and immersion. So they reached out to some friends who had experience and expressed interest to try something new, including myself. And a small group of us made a pitch demo for Moss by early 2016, which helped secure our initial round of investment funding later that same year. Now, this funding was just enough to bankroll the creation of the full game. Production on Moss began around August of 2016, and the final game was on the PlayStation Store by February of 2018. Now, if you're counting, you'll notice that that's not a very long time for a development cycle, but it's what we could afford. So one of the big standout aspects of Moss has turned out to be Quill, its protagonist. Now, many people have built an emotional bond with Quill. But bonding with Quill wasn't originally one of our goals. It became one sometime during production of Moss, requiring us to alter project goals to include this, which means the game we envisioned at the start was fundamentally different from the game we shipped, which honestly is a very good thing. So as many of you here can attest, simply creating a game is a challenge. Creating a new intellectual property, such as Moss and its appealing protagonist, Quill, is an even greater challenge. Doing so in VR, an emerging industry where precedent doesn't exist, further compounds this challenge. And doing all of this while starting our own studio, the odds were really stacked against us. We knew this would be an immense undertaking for our small team, but we had experience on our side. When talking to the team about this challenge, I'd often compare it to a boss fight. We've all been on our own adventures in this industry, leveling up, getting a good inventory of potions and elixirs, grinding side quests, and now we're ready to tackle the beast. The beast that's hidden in the production of the project. If we weren't ready for it, the beast could easily consume us, so we needed to be prepared. So we asked ourselves, how can we leverage our past experiences but not become trapped by them? How do we use that experience to evolve the process as we understand it? And how do we do all this without creating more problems than the ones we're trying to solve? Now, these questions and the answers we came up with are how we created Moss. Today, I'll be talking specifically about our approach to creating animation content. And so I present to you Freeform space switching. So to do this, I'll illustrate our need for quality animation content made as quickly as possible. I'll discuss the challenges that all animators and riggers face when creating animation for a game. And finally, I'm going to dive deep into the animation process we use to create Moss and discuss the potential uses for it at runtime. Now, creating games and animation for games is inherently a subjective topic, meaning there's hundreds of ways to solve any given problem, and I'm not here to advocate for any specific process over another. My goal is to provide useful inspiration that you can use for your own projects through the trials and tribulations we've endured. So let's start by framing the need for quality animation content made quickly by discussing Quill. Moss is a game where the overarching theme is centered around the bond you create with Quill, which requires a tremendous amount of quality animation content to accomplish. Quill ended up with about 1,000 unique animation clips. These clips could greatly vary in length and complexity, and some clips were really small, consisting of a single pose used as an additive offset, while other clips were incredibly large, consisting of entire cinematic scenes lasting nearly 2 minutes in length. So due to these factors, I admit, counting clips to measure workload is wildly unreliable, but it's the best metric I can find to quickly describe a general sense of scope. Essentially, Quill was a substantial undertaking. She's indicative of the effort required to make a character full of life. And it's even more of a challenge when the player can control the character. Now, some of you may be thinking, rightly so, is it really? You're an indie dev. Just make an idle loop, a run cycle, and an attack animation, the basics, and you're good to go. Make the animation highly stylized so you can get away with it. Why overcomplicate things? Just feed the beast. Well, this is actually a very good question. Now, technically, sure, that's certainly a route we could have chosen, and it would have provided Quill with base-level content to respond to controller inputs. But limiting Quill to those basic clips would have betrayed the immersion of VR, leaving us with a simple gameplay avatar. Now, remember that Moss pitch demo I told you about at the start? Quill was in that demo, and she was just a simple gameplay avatar. There's really not much going on here. She has roughly about 10 animations, and she doesn't feel alive yet. If we would have stuck with this approach and simply polished what was here, she would have been proficient, but not memorable. It's because she's merely a gameplay abstraction here. Now, we knew we needed to do more than the basic level of gameplay interaction content. Moss is a VR game after all, and you, as the player, are inside the world of Moss with Quill. She's aware of your presence and needs to communicate that awareness. She needs to be more than an avatar. She needs to be your friend. So, leveraging the added interactive opportunities which VR provides, we created a bevy of ways she could be more than a simple gameplay avatar. Here's a few examples. She doesn't like being snuck up on. So, even a simple idle animation would need a bevy of crafted poses, which the Unreal Engine calls blend spaces, to describe how she looks around her environment. She'd also need variations on the idle itself, with additive overlays for subtle things like eye squints or ear twitches or weight shifts. Quill's shipping idle animation set alone was much larger than her entire animation set from the original demo. But if Quill simply idled, she wouldn't feel alive. She needs to respond to what the player is doing. Watching people play the early demo, when they first met Quill, they'd often wave to her. And in that demo, she'd just stare at them blankly in return, which was ultra fucking creepy. Not the greatest way to build a bond, so we decided to give her the ability to wave back. So the guys, they're commenting here, and then they wave to her, and oh my God, she's waving back. And one of the cool things is, if you wave too much, she grows a little impatient with you. So being able to pet Quill and have her react to it is another way to make her more than just an avatar. Every time we add something like this into the gameplay space, we help tell her story outside of cinematics and the traditional narrative. And by the way, if you pet her too long, She gets a little annoyed. Setting personal boundaries in a friendship is really important. It's what everyone does with their friends, and she does this with you. So Moss was revealed to the world at E3 2017. It was a playable demo on the show floor, and we got our first chance to see how the general audience would react to our game. One thing we noticed is that people really wanted to high-five Quill after beating some enemies or solving a puzzle. But they didn't really expect her to high-five them, did they? That's not what a game character does, right? So we gave her a high five. And if you leave her hanging, she's a confident, secure, and self-reliant mouse who doesn't need your approval to party. But all of these great interactions would have felt completely out of place if Quill's gameplay wasn't robust and solid feeling. There's a base level of functionality people expect to see in real, breathing creatures. Things like obeying physics and never seeing clip boundaries, responding to uneven terrain at varying speeds while leaning into turns. Essentially, every moment Quill spends not acting in a relatable and realistic way negatively affects immersion. And representing all of these nuanced circumstances takes a lot of animation content, hundreds of clips just to describe everything she needs to do when simply moving around in her world. And interacting with her environment is just as important. Aligning the animation content with the world, making sure all of her climbing content would look good if it were interrupted for any reason, making variations based on the type of object she's climbing. For example, when hanging from a ledge, can she place her feet on a wall or do they swing freely? And all of this is necessary, and quality can't be sacrificed. If the individual clips aren't convincing, if they don't feel real, relatable, appealing, or if they're puppet-like in any way, the amount of animation wouldn't save her performance, and she'd revert back to being a simple gameplay avatar. Everything just needed to fall into place. Sorry, I had to do that. I have a lot of fun with those puns. So, Quill wasn't our only character. She may have been our most expensive character, but Moss has 3 basic enemy types. Unlike Quill, these enemies can be simple gameplay representations. They do not have strong narrative-based personalities. They are gameplay mechanics in character form. But it's still important to make them appealing and fit within the same world as Quill. This means they all need to obey physics, react to their environment correctly, feel weighty, not pop between animation clips, yada yada. They also need to feel emotion, so they'll celebrate when defeating Quill or taunt her when they first notice her presence. This meant that each enemy had about 100 or so clips each, which pales in comparison to Quill, but is expensive in their own right. And beyond that, we had numerous cinematic story-specific characters. These characters were relegated to being inside of the book or in small cinematic moments, so it didn't require a lot of gameplay interaction. Yet anyone in film will tell you, even without the interactive element being a factor, animating compelling acting performances, it can still take time. We had 2 bosses, a spherical eye who would instantly disintegrate Quill if he looked at her, and this large snake who chases Quill over the course of 7 rooms. The snake in particular was quite challenging, as he needed to interact with the environment and be able to watch Quill as she moved around the environment and attack Quill wherever she happened to be located. He also needed to seamlessly blend between gameplay and cinematic moments, as you see here. Now, I'm not sure how many of you here have attempted to rig and animate a sentient, angry rope before, but making him seem intentional, organic, and responsive to gameplay interactions was super challenging. Yeah. Oh, that looks painful. And that kill and that kick, that was actually me venting my frustrations at animating that thing. So finally, we had a world filled with ambient life, such as mouse villagers, birds, bugs, deer, as well as environmental animation, vines, trees, movable statues, stairs, stuff like that. And all of this needed animation content that doesn't betray immersion. So now that you've seen what we ended up creating, the question I'd like you to consider is, how did we get here, given the challenges we faced? And with a development schedule of about 2 years, including pre-production, this was a tremendous amount of work. Now, keep in mind, this wasn't just creating the animation content itself. It was rigging the characters and setting them up in-game. Also keep in mind, Polyarc is a new studio. We had nothing to build on, and most of us had never even used Unreal before. We had to learn how to use the engine, we had to construct pipelines, we had to figure out what Moss even is. Everything was from scratch. And to make matters even more complicated, I'm currently our only animator and rigger. Being an indie studio means we're on a limited budget. Any money we spend on more employees or outsource help is money we'd have to make up in sales. When Moss, a new IP, was scheduled to launch on PSVR, an emerging platform where the potential customer pool was about 2 million people at best at that time, spending a ton of money on any single aspect of the game would have made success more difficult to achieve. Now, keeping costs low wasn't just ideal, it was non-negotiable. I'm also getting older, with about 19 years of experience as a professional animator. I've done my share of crunches in the past, and I'm not willing to crunch like I'm 27 years old anymore. I have a spouse and 3 adorable spawn, and even though Moss and Polyarc are both incredibly important to me, they're not as important as my family. Living my life is paramount. But if animation ends up being the weak point for the game and it fails because of me, well, I don't want to be the reason my friend's lifelong dream dies a horrible death. So luckily, our design team helped with some of the in-game character setup responsibilities, and our engineering team provided a ton of solid framework allowing for such character depth. And our amazing art team did inspired work creating such appealing character designs. Our art director, Chris, even did a few environmental animations for me. We're a team, after all. But now picture yourself in this situation and ask yourself how you would solve these problems. Well, right or wrong, here's what I did. Looking holistically at animation pipelines of my past, I asked myself, what does the animation and rigging team spend most of their time doing? Where are the problem points, and how can we avoid them, or at least streamline them? So the first thing I noticed is supporting a monolithic character pipeline. I certainly need a character pipeline in place, but if I'm not careful, this can take a tremendous amount of time to create. How can I make a powerful and robust pipeline on the cheap? Number 2, creating a system that makes iteration difficult or costly. In Creativity Inc., Ed Catmull talks about the beast and the ugly baby. It's how Pixar envisioned the problem of iteration. Like film, every game project begins as a pale comparison to mature, shipped games. Moss was no different. It certainly started as an ugly baby. We knew we needed to build iteration and flexibility into our process. Not just to minimize the impact on the beast, but to allow for creative exploration, and so new ideas have time to mature. For me, this meant assuring animation changes could happen quickly without affecting quality. So animation was never a limiting factor on design or exploration. And 3, it's animating that girl there, and actually all the characters in the game. Creating quality animation content is, in itself, a huge time sink. So how can I streamline this process without reducing our quality? So now that we understand the appetite of the beast and how hard it is to feed it, we can focus on coming up with ways to do so. So I do need to define a term before I go into our solution so we're all on the same page here. When I talk about the rig, what I'm actually referring to is the animation control rig. At Polyarc, we have the character setup here, which includes the mesh, skeleton, sockets, and point weights. And due to the constraints of working in a game engine, it's easiest if we don't alter any part of the character or the setup. Other than adding the occasional leaf node for attachments, the skeletal hierarchy will usually never change once the character is finalized. Our animation control rig, or rig for short, are the handles we interact with when animating inside of Maya. When our rig is applied, it lives outside the character setup and drives the skeleton using constraints. The rig is not exported into Unreal and operates inside of Maya exclusively. This allows us to alter our rig however we choose without altering the character setup. So the best way to solve a problem is to make sure you fully understand the question, and by not assuming that the optimal answers have already been discovered. I question the need for Maya files in storing rigs in reference scenes. We could save one source Maya file per character, so we can preserve our materials, our display layers, and our file settings, but beyond that, is there really a reason to save Maya animation files? But what really is the problem with Maya animation files? Well, referencing prevents hierarchy changes to the rig, which will limit workflow options. If we don't reference and we choose to save Maya files with local rigs inside of them, we'd eventually need a batching process to distribute updates. But more importantly, we use Unreal, which utilizes the FBX format as its source. When we create new animations or make changes to existing animations inside of Unreal, it outputs to FBX. And if we save Maya files and Unreal saves FBX files, doesn't that desync our data? So we decided to make Maya files optional for animation. We can save them. The point is we no longer need to save them. Any Maya file will be considered ancillary and not the archival format. Unreal, Unity, and all major animation packages use FBX, and so will we. Future animators can work in whatever animation package they want, such as Max, Motion Builder, Unreal, Unity, whatever. Any updates that Unreal does to the FBX file is now accounted for. Nothing's ever out of date, and I don't need to write a bunch of batching scripts. But that leaves the question, where do our animation rigs live? Well, we can store our rigs inside of a script. We can start an animation by opening the source Maya file for the character we're working on, import any existing animation if needed from the FBX, and apply the rig over the animation data. The trick here is making sure the rig doesn't cause any degradation of animation while applying. But the benefits of working this way are simplicity and flexibility. If I make a change to the rig itself, I simply update the script, and the next time I apply it, I'm actually applying the latest version of the rig. Oh boy, it's not plugged in. Pause for a second. All right, the power strip I plugged into apparently wasn't powered. So we're good to go. Thanks for bearing with me. But what about all the data traditionally saved in a Maya file? Are we really okay with not archiving that data? Well, yeah, absolutely. Aren't those benefits the same constraints, complicating iteration, and requiring a suite of tools to support? Tools which I certainly don't have the manpower to create. And we can still use animation layers, motion paths, the time editor, all the great stuff that Maya provides. And we could even save those Maya files if we choose. We just need to be mindful that those scenes are now temporary. So as animators gain experience, they also gain workflow knowledge. Yet, in some circumstances, you may find brilliant scripting experts making workflow decisions for the animators. This usually happens because the person writing the tool or the rig can be seen as the decision maker. But the problem here is the workflow experts aren't the ones designing the workflow. And when there's a lack of collaboration between them, tools can become inefficient or even a barrier to the creative process. You may have a well-written tool, but it may not enable the animator. Knowledge-based decision-making is needed to empower content creators. In our situation, we actually have the opposite problem. I know the animation workflow well, but I don't know anything about Python, and I need to make rigs that bake over the bones without any loss or alteration of the motion. I'm sure I could learn Python, but that would take time away from the more important task, which is making the game. And I could potentially outsource our rigs, but if they break, I'd be in the dark about fixing problems myself. And I'm honestly too much of a control freak for that. And candidly speaking, being up here on stage at Siggraph is wildly intimidating to me, because I know that when it comes to my scripts, I feel like a fraud because I've never been trained as a rigger or a scripter before. And maybe I am a fraud because I can't math. That really is me. I mean, it's not my receipt. I wouldn't put that on stage at Siggraph, but I still can't math. So why am I here on stage, and what do I know? Well, I know that the output window in Maya will echo every command that I make as in the output window. And thanks to my experience as an animator, I can do all the operations manually to build a rig over an existing animation without any data loss. Therefore, I can use the output window's MEL to teach myself rigging by simply performing the steps myself and copying the output into a script and cleaning it up. Could a real rigger do better? Absolutely. But I'm all Polyarc has. And this is what I'm capable of doing within a tight schedule and on a thin budget. And this is actually how all character rigs for Moss were made. Now, the point here is that making the perfect solution may not always be possible, but making a working solution is always necessary. Letting yourself become paralyzed by the downsides of a given solution has defeated many before me. I was determined not to let that happen, despite my ignorance. For future projects, I sincerely hope to collaborate with a brilliant rigger who respects knowledge-based decision-making, because I'm fully aware that we can do much, much better than we have. So how do we make the animation process faster and more iterative while keeping a focus on quality? Well, we start by reducing the complexity commonly found in traditional animation rigs and focus more on flexibility. We also need to automate some of the more routine steps. Now, an understanding of animation principles is beneficial beyond this point, not necessary. I'm going to try and explain everything as intimately as possible, but hopefully you guys have some general knowledge there. So, optimal rig settings for the many different situations an animator may encounter is nearly impossible for one rig to do well. Like, I'm sure you guys have all worked where you hadn't set up your rig at the start and you came up with a context in which you were animating and you're like, crap, I didn't set the rig up to do that when I started. Damn it. So, for example, optimal rig settings between posing and tweening can be quite different. Let's say you set up your rig with an FK spine because posing your character is actually really easy this way. But tweening with an FK spine requires a ton of counter-animating to prevent the head from wobbling. I mean, you wouldn't animate a bouncing ball by putting it at the end of a bone chain and rotating those bones to make the ball bounce, would you? I mean, I apparently did because I'm a lunatic, but... So why try and tween a spine this way? Yet, setting up a rig for the optimal tweening process has a different set of trade-offs that would impact how easy it is to do posing. Now, I could go into all the details on the many different approaches to rigging and the trade-offs they create, but the problem I always seem to run into is the same. I need to alter my rig in meaningful ways as I work to be most effective. Now, this means being able to convert the animation data of any object into any space or relative to any other object. It also means having the option to alter the hierarchy without any animation loss. Essentially, opening the animation sandbox to as many options as we can, allowing for creative problem solving as we animate. So how do we do this? Most studios create rigs featuring numerous attributes used to drive everything from fingers to foot rolls. The idea behind this approach is to empower the animator, to give them fine-tuned control over the animation process. But what it actually does is limit the animator's workflow, forcing a manual animation process. It prevents the animator from switching the relative space of the control without altering the motion itself. Now, this can lead to counter-animating and editing curves that may not directly relate to the motion itself. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying that custom attributes are a bad way to animate. What I'm saying that is, for me personally, they slow me down. So at Polyarc, we're using custom attributes for facial rig controls only. The ability to switch the space of any rig component is essential to our workflow and what we refer to as freeform space switching. Keeping all the animation data in the form of translation, rotation, and scale maintains a simple and easy to understand interface, while also making a nearly unlimited animation sandbox. And this huge sandbox allows us to create workflows which automate the animation process in many situations, rather than providing a ton of manual animation options. Any scripts I make are optional modules that can vary between broad and specific workflow optimizations. So now I'm excited to show you a breakdown of some of this in action. So for those of you space switching animation experts out there in the audience, please be patient with my first one or two examples here. The basics are important to explain so that everyone can kind of get the examples after that. So in this example, you're about to see how a child object, in this case a bone, without any keyframes on it, can be converted into world space to create new motion. So take a look at his shell. You'll notice that it's not animating. It's just doing what the body's doing. Now I want to create overlapping action on his shell. So to begin, I'm creating a locator, constraining that locator to his shell bone, and baking the locator down. The baking process plots the motion to the locator so that its motion is identical to the shell's bone. I'm then deleting the constraint on the locator and constraining the bone to the locator. This converts the local motion of the bone to world space movement on the locator. At first, there's no difference, but I can now offset the animation of the locator in time to create overlapping action. I can also play with the amount of delay and the scale of individual curves to increase or decrease the overall motion. Essentially, I'm using motion already found in the body to create new motion. Now, I could choose to animate his overlapping action by hand, as many would obviously do. But this approach here that you're looking at, it can be scripted and automated. I do it for this animation, and the next animation, I press the button. So Maya has a great motion trails tool. It gives you a visual representation of motion through space and allows you to edit the path of that object directly. That is, unless the object you're trying to control is translated via rotation. The translation of the tip of Quill's sword here comes from the translation and rotation of her wrist holding that sword. And that rotation will often cause wobble or jitter, requiring us to counter-rotate the wrist until the tip of the sword does what we want it to do. Then if we need to alter timing, it'll screw up all the counter animation we just did. It complicates iteration. And here you can see Quill swinging a sword. Notice how the trail of the sword is pretty busted looking, especially towards the end of her swing as her wrist turns over. I posed her to aim the sword out, but in between core posing, the way Maya is solving the rotation doesn't look great on the sword. Now I can try and fix the sword by rotating it frame by frame, but that's crazy making. Instead, I'm going to create a locator at the tip of the sword and parent constrain it to the wrist, maintaining offset. I'll let the video catch up. I talked a little fast. Cool. Then I'm going to bake that locator down and delete the constraint because I no longer need it anymore. Then I'm going to create two more locators, one a child of the other. I'm then going to grab her wrist and grab the parent locator and do a point and orient constraint without maintaining offset. And I purposely do point and orient on this, and I'll explain why in a second. So now I can lock down the translation of that locator because I don't want it to ever bake or deviate from what the wrist is doing. And then I bake that locator down. And that plots all of its rotation. So now I don't need the orient constraint anymore. So now I aim the child locator at the tip of the sword's locator using an aim constraint. And I make sure that the parent locator is used as the up vector. That I then use that child locator to control the wrist, at the orientation of the wrist. Now when I move that tip of the sword, it rotates the hand. Very simple. And the cool thing is, these curves I'm editing now, they represent exactly what the tip of that sword is doing in world space. My keys represent what that thing is doing. My keys don't represent some abstract information, rotation information that doesn't necessarily give me an idea of what the tip of the sword's translation is doing. And the cool thing here is, after I'm done cleaning it up, I could even add a motion trail to it and just work this way if I wanted to. Now I'm using that motion trail to control rotation. So as I mentioned earlier, there are a ton of different ways to control the spine of a character. There's human IK, spline IK, simple FK. There's tons of things out there. For me, none of the existing methods worked ideally in all situations. Each approach has pros and cons, so the system I built focuses on replacing the spine's rigging components based on the task at hand. And let me show you. So here you can see Quill. She's just doing a basic recoil animation, and I just plotted the rig on her real quick. And the rig, when it first starts, is in FK space, meaning I rotate something in the spine and it translates everything above it. Now, it is world space rotation, so I'm not inheriting rotation from that. So I can also switch the arms between IK and FK, and it just bakes them out. I tend to work in FK when I go to this next step, which is the aim space spine, which is what I'm in now. Now I can grab those same controls, and I can translate them, and they create rotation in the things coming in and out of them. And the cool part is, when I'm switching between these spaces, nothing has changed in the animation. I'm just viewing my data in a different way. So here's the breakdown of the hierarchy I use for my spine tweening process. It's a series of aim constraints where each control aims at the one above it. The rotational up vector is based on the rotation from my core posing, which is how I'm avoiding any of the gimbal issues. And when I translate the rig component, it alters the rotation of the spine bones as an offset from what they were previously doing. Most of my time is spent tweening the 5 main translation objects, which are the head's look-at target, head, chest, abdomen, and hips. I can also edit the clavicles as an offset from my chest if I wanted to. But with solid core posing, any clavicle edits are usually pretty minor. And having so few objects to control makes the tweening process really fast. And depending on the animation style I'm trying to achieve, I can make slight alterations to this script. For example, along with orient constraining the bones to the rig controls, I can also point constrain them. And controlling the translation directly will provide a more cartoony look with squash and stretch looking results, while the rotation-only version of this provides a more realistic mocap-looking result. Now, tails. Tails are such a tricky thing to animate. Getting them to move through space fluidly, but also interact with ground or walls, it can be very time-consuming. And most animators I've worked with in my past have preferred to just use FK rotations to animate the tail and then offset the rotations in time. I'd watch them counter-animate wobble caused by gimbals or rotation order problems. They'd spend hours trying to get the tail to slap the ground and slide along it nice. There has to be a better way. Well, here I start with basic FK rotation on her tail. It doesn't look great. It's going through some walls and some floors. And I prove that it's in FK here because I didn't trust myself. All right, now I switch it to that aim space I'm using on Quill's spine. So now I can actually just grab those components directly, and it changes the rotation of the tail aiming at it. And if anything's going through the ground, I set it to 0. Now the tail doesn't go through the ground anymore. I can also find the distance of that wall, and I can see any curves that go past that and set them to that distance. Now it doesn't go through the wall. I could even offset parts of the tail in time, and the cool thing about offsetting translation in time is I'm not just offsetting any rotations, which can create wobble. I'm actually just altering the way it moves through space, which will create non-uniform rotations to compensate for that wobble. So, much like a tail, a snake needs to be intentional, interact with the world, and move fluidly. But this snake is huge. He can easily fill the environment in moss, and he can also choose to lead his motion with any part of his body. In one scene in particular, his head comes up as his body slowly pours into the interactive space from the middle out. It's a nightmare. And he needs to do performances such as this while watching and attacking Quill as she moves about the space. So on top of all the custom environmental navigation, we need a sample space of looking and attacking that covers the range of the entire room and works as a layer over any base clip. This means we can't choose one way to animate the snake. And building multiple workflow methods into one single rig could overcomplicate the animation process and the rigging pipeline. So we came up with multiple ways to animate him that would replace the previous method of interaction on the fly. So the first way I decided to animate the snake is via a path follow system. I start by pressing the path follow button, which automatically attaches the snake to the path found in the scene and has him travel based on the active timeline. I can then bake him back down and remove the path and the pathing rig. But a simple path follow doesn't look lifelike. There's no specific lead and follow inside the body. It's more like a train. So I can then apply an FK rig where I can animate him acting more intentional using animation layers. The cool thing here about FK rotation on such a large spine is that the rotation creates interesting, unintentional arcs of the body. But it's really difficult to refine the motion in FK, so the next step is to bake them back down again and delete the FK rig. I then apply a very complex version of Quill's aim space spine. This allows me to do a few key things. I can edit translation directly, so I can fine-tune control of the performance easily. I can edit large swaths of the body with a few simple controls, so I don't need to micromanage the 40-plus bones that are in this thing. I can rotate the controls, which is something Quill's aim space spine doesn't even support. Ultimately, this allows me to work quickly while giving the snake organic-looking results. Now, by separating the rig into these modules, I can approach each animation challenge differently. Path following for moving around a room, FK rotation on the bone so I can craft safe additional additive blend spaces. Finally, an aim space solver to help refine the previous steps and to make more organic-looking performance results. And this is what I get. Now, this video was actually compressed down so I can match it to my talking points, but the original video was just over 8 minutes. That's how long it took to make that. So originally, the snake was actually much more snake-like. He'd slither under and behind the player, trying not to be seen and leaving a lot to the imagination. This turned out to be utterly terrifying, completely changing the tone of the game, so we gave him armor and made him much more visible. But one of the ways in which he'd move around the environment was also more snake-like, which gave people the heebie-jeebies, which I'm going to do for you. So, very scary, right? That's just a bunch of rotation on his root on the z-axis. And I can use that information by pressing this button, and it makes this. That animation came from one rotation on the z-axis. If I wanted to change that animation, I just undo that button press, rotate it a little bit more, a little bit less, change it in time, press the button again. And I'm generating lots and lots of different slithers. So why am I showing you this? Well, it's a great example of how insanely powerful freeform space switching can even be. Every animation has a wealth of valuable motion hidden inside of it. Why not make tools that utilize that information without requiring animators to manually build it all? Speaking of manually building your animation, overlap and detail can be fun, but it really takes time. And depending on the skill of the animator, it may or may not look consistent. Leveraging physics to supplement this area is a huge time saver and allows for more realism if done correctly. And here's a quick video showing one of the ways I use physics. I have this basic ball, and it's just moving around. It's very boring, right? Some simple motion on it, lots of linear keys, some curves. And then I press the physics button. Now it's more interesting because it has a lot of overlap and settle to it. So to do this, using the selected object, the ball, I point constrain locator A to it and bake it down. This removes any rotation from the source without actually altering the source. This is necessary so the simulation will work in world space where up, down, left, and right are actually up, down, left, and right. I then create a particle with a variable goal weight and constrain the emitter to locator A. This way, the emitter does exactly what the source object did, and the particle tries to follow it. I then use the translation attribute from the particle itself to control another locator called locator B. Finally, I point constrain the source object to locator B and bake the source object. Since there's no need for the particle in the locators anymore, I delete them, and I'm left with that. So, a wobbly ball is kind of boring, right? How do I actually use this on a character performance? Well, I start here. You see Quill's just in a core posing. And then I'm just going to throw it into auto tangents real quick and then clean up a little bit of her center of gravities up and down. And that's all I've done to get to this point. It's just very basic. So I'm going to switch her spine into that aim space I showed you earlier. And I'm going to apparently prove it because I, again, don't trust myself. And then from here, I'm just going to start running physics on her spine components. I can run varying degrees of physics, more or less, and I can run it multiple times if I wanted to on certain objects. And this is what I'm left with. Natural overlap. I can also grab the middle of her spine and just start offsetting it in time because I'm crazy and I'm going to break everything, right? I'm actually not. The cool thing about altering this aim space is I'm not changing the rest of the body. I'm only changing the attribute I'm working on at the given moment. I'm not causing problems for the rest of the body. And just because a physics trick controls translation doesn't mean you can't use that translation to create rotation using aim constraints. So here, check out her ears. They're just core posing. The ears aren't actually doing much right now. So I press the animate this shit button. And now they are. Now, I could manually animate Quill's ears if I chose to. There are certain high-action clips that require an animator's hand to accomplish, but the point here is that this is an optional tool, not my replacement. As an animator, I'm able to make plug-and-play scripts for common animation needs myself. Now, this flexibility comes from a simple and open sandbox set of tools. When we started Moss, I was actually manually doing all of this animation by hand. In a day, I was only able to produce about 3, maybe 4 seconds of shippable animation for Quill. And after I wrote all of these tools, I'm now able to produce up to 15 seconds or so of shippable animation in a day. Now finally, I'd like to show you this last animation. This little guy here was an early prototype character for a demo we made years ago. Technically, this animation isn't complex. It's essentially 2 core poses, some simple lead and follow, some jiggly overlap, and some little details. It looks like any ton of other clips that are shown on my demo reel, so why am I showing this here? It's because this isn't my animation. This was made by Mike Jensen, one of our artists. He's never animated before. This is his first animation, and he did this in under 8 hours. Granted, he was stumbling through my horrible UI of my tool set, and he broke the crap out of my rig multiple times. He asked lots of questions, and he fought through the learning process. He's very, very talented. But the fact that Mike could even do this, how his result looked consistent with the rest of the animation in the world of Moss, how someone without experience as an animator can use these tools effectively. Instead of adding lots of confusing manual animation process to an already deep and complex process such as animation, it's reducing animation complexity down into simple, easy to understand steps. It's making the path of least resistance guide the creator to the desired results without removing creative choices. Now, Maya is a fantastic application for authoring animation content. Maya 2019 even adds an amazing new caching feature for smoother animation playback, which I love. But I'm not using any of the fancy new tools or plugins to do anything I've shown you here today. This is all done using simple hierarchy changes, constraints, and baking, which is Maya's base level of functionality. This same workflow could essentially be the same if it were using the original release of Maya back in 1998. Now, why am I mentioning this? It's because of the potential this creates for animating within a game engine. If a game engine provided these same base-level tools, it could replicate this process inside of the engine. But I'll get back to that in just a moment. For now, I'd like to ask you to imagine a potential future with me. What if you can solve your runtime playback using a runtime rig that can currently solve the animation data in multiple spaces, which it dynamically switches between based on context for optimal playback? Now, I'm not talking about simple IK fix-up, which has been in games for over a decade now. I'm proposing a full-body rig to support a wider range of data manipulation. Imagine one single walk cycle being solved simultaneously in 2 different user-defined rig spaces and then driving the skeleton. As the engine plays that single clip, both spaces would provide identical visual results, but when blending additional additive or override animation content, the optimal space for a given context would vary, just like it does when authoring content. Back in 2014, when I was with Bungie, I did a GDC presentation on that idea. Destiny's Guardians needed to have a complex set of overlays to describe aiming and looking around their environment. Oftentimes, these additive pose overlays would look terrible, like that, when solved on an FK skeleton, especially if the underlying base animation was too robust. And keeping the base animation simple was the anti-solution. So I came up with a set of full-body spatial definitions I wanted to use at runtime and pitched the idea of a runtime rig to Tam Armstrong, who was the animation engineering lead at the time and is currently Polyarc CEO. Luckily, he was already thinking the same thing. These play blasts are what we used to pitch the idea, and this in-engine footage is what we shipped with. Tam and another animation engineer, Eric Brown, wrote Bungie's runtime rig system to encompass the entire body. It included controls for IK and FK using game inputs such as the look direction of the player as a relative parent for the motion of any bone, and separating translation from rotation. It essentially mimicked the constraints from Maya, allowing me to set up parent, point, orient, and aim constraints to rig controls for runtime solving. Now, back then, we were only solving in a single rig space. And before leaving Bungie, I'd hoped to pitch simultaneous abstract spatial solving as version 2 of their runtime rig. If this were the case, you could solve clip blends in all viable spaces at once and choose which solve the skeleton uses. Imagine multiple train tracks, each one taking a different route to the same destination. Now imagine that you can instantly switch that train to the optimal track at any time. You wouldn't be relegated to one track's inefficiency. You could switch the train to a secondary track whenever it was the more optimal route. And once you have that, why limit the train to only 2 tracks? Why not have a bevy of train tracks and a set of rules the user can create to decide where the train goes? Essentially, you'd create a selection set of defined rig usages to cover the various character performance contexts. Now, imagine a character who could run around aiming a rifle or holding a one-handed sword. Both of these represent a different optimal rig space. For a rifle, you'd want to solve the rotation of the gun relative to the aiming direction of the player, while the translation is relative to the player pill so that up and down stays up and down regardless of the rotation. You'd also want the arms and IK space as an offset from the gun itself so the hands animate correctly as an offset from it. But for a sword, you'd want essentially the opposite to be true. You'd want to solve the rotation of the upper arms and chest space and everything below that in FK, while the sword is solved as a child of the hand holding it. When the player switches between the rifle and the sword, the skeleton would switch playback to the optimal rig space. Now, many studios are already solving examples such as this using ingenious workarounds and IK fix-up tricks. And I know this because at Polyarc, that's actually how we're solving these issues too. But these solutions are focused on specifics. They take work, and they're not holistic. Choosing your optimal playback space at runtime would be very similar to all the animation space switching stuff I've shown you here today. But setting up these spaces would be an additional burden. Or would it? Both Unity and Unreal have expressed interest in creating animation content entirely within their engines. Today, you'll find out more about Unity's approach straight from David and Michael here. But as I mentioned earlier, if Unreal or Unity created an animation toolset based on a modular, freeform workflow, not only would it be more efficient to do your animation work inside of one single package, but you could then start creating rigging and automation tools to benefit both content creation and runtime playback. The process of rigging the character for authoring content could also be used to solve many of the runtime playback solutions. Now, regrettably, this is actually not something our small team at Polyarc has the manpower or time to actively pursue, but I'm hoping that sometime in the future we'll hopefully have the opportunity to help bring some of these ideas to life. So in conclusion, as the animation quality bar continues to rise and as animation technology continues to march forward, it's easy to assume that the process of creating and using animation will inherently be more difficult. But to me, this suggests a need to simplify, which will empower artists with more creative autonomy, and this creativeness will feed growth. Now, hopefully this presentation has resonated with you in some tangible ways. My goal here today is to inspire and empower others to help build up the industry that supports us all. Like I said earlier, there's no right or wrong way to make games, just an assortment of ideas and results that we all share as an industry. I urge you to be more open with your own workflows, because the more we share with each other, the better we'll all become. Now, hopefully, I didn't kill you all with boredom here. Thank you to Siggraph and, thanks for the opportunity to be here today, and thank you all once again for your time. Do we have time for questions? Time for questions if you get up for it.